last video was a pre-record and the introduction to a new series, and this is also the introduction to a new series in which every month of 2026 I will be drawing one of the Fatui Harbingers from Genshin Impact for each corresponding month in coordination with their rank, if that makes sense. Essentially, whatever their number in way of rank is the month they are being assigned, but numerically. On top of that, we will be discussing their canon selves and their fanon interpretations before their canonical introductions, and or just how they are imagined within the canon. And for January, I bring you none other than Capitano. Now, depending on what era we're pulling from, his fanon interpretation was either the furthest from his canon or actually pretty close. Said interpretation, though, also changes depending on who is writing him, drawing him, or interpreting him, but either way, some things actually wound up being pretty close. There were people who interpreted him as being very mean and very cruel, which I think is how a lot of people expected him to be. But there were also people who actually portrayed him as very sweet and very kind, which, as we know, is more how he wound up being once we met him in canon. Though I will say the most common interpretation was sort of a mix of the two, often treating people he's close with very nicely and politely. Often these people were written as being either Piero, Pulcinella, or Signora, or also, a big one that I saw, kids. Notably Tartaglia's siblings. And actually, maybe not kind and sweet is the right word, but I think selfless is more correct. Especially when we're talking about his canon self. Now, before his introduction in Natlan, we had 3 voice lines about him from other Harbingers, those being the only playable Harbingers at the time, Tartaglia, Scaramouche, Wanderer, and Arlecchino. And I find it interesting because all 3 of their lines about him are all very different from each other. Arlecchino's voice line talks about how he is very powerful, and with that power comes a high level of responsibility, and how she believes that makes him very worthy of respect. Wanderer also notes that he has great personal strength, but that he's sort of annoyed about how much praise the captain gets, and Tartaglia is essentially fanboying the whole time, talking about how he's seen him in battle before, but perhaps he's too low ranked to be noticed, but maybe he'll recognize his strengths one day. Tartaglia is just fanboying over this guy. And actually, for a new voice line that I didn't have when I started recording this, Columbina's voice line about the captain says that many respect him, though many also fear him, which is in a similar vein to Arlecchino's voice line about him. And I know comparing her voice lines to the others is kind of unfair, given, for her at least, they have a more clear idea of where they're going with the other ones from here on out. And then they also have actual interpretations of the previous Harbingers. However, one thing that I think a lot of people need to get into their heads is that for the longest time, we were only working with Tartaglia's voice lines, which, in all honesty, never really sounded all that reliable. Mostly because, and we'll get into this in November when we do him, with him being the youngest of the Harbingers, he is also presumably the newest. Therefore, he hasn't really had the time to build relationships or bond with the other Harbingers, outside of Pulcinella, but he's not relevant to this conversation. Meanwhile, I feel like the others' voice lines are a bit more reliable because they've had anywhere from decades to centuries to get to know each other. Even though it does seem apparent that they all have a vendetta against someone else among their ranks. And I mean, if you worked and possibly even lived with the same people for that long, you would probably have a vendetta against a couple of them too. And actually, I know I said earlier that Pulcinella isn't relevant to this conversation. He actually is. I don't know how many people remember this, but back in the early days of the Harbingers, before we had clear ranks for everyone, we had more than a handful of open spots, which led a lot of people to believe that Capitano was actually ranked lower than he wound up being, with the two most common you'd see being on the high end, rank 4, which we now know goes to Arlecchino, and on the low end, rank 10, which is still anonymous to if anyone holds that position at all. And I will not lie, I am guilty of this. About 2 years ago, I posted a fanfic one-shot where I had Capitano at rank 10 instead of rank 1, because we still weren't sure, again, about a lot of ranks, his being one of them. I should really go back and edit it, but at the same time, I don't want to. Mostly because I wouldn't just be changing, like, one sentence, I'd have to edit, like, almost a whole damn paragraph. But what I was getting to was back in the days when he was ranked lower, a lot of people had this sort of headcanon idea that I still really like of Capitano sort of working as Pulcinella's bodyguard part-time. And also, though, just sort of in general as a bodyguard for any of the Harbingers who needed one. Like, yes, in reality, when push comes to shove, most of them should be able to stand their ground on their own and not need help. However, I just like the idea of it. And actually, on the note of that one shot, I unintentionally wrote all the Harbingers to be kind of close with each other. At the time, I wasn't really the biggest fan of it. I tried to make them seem more distant with each other, but like now with everything that's come out about them all about in Nod Cry, I'm like, damn, I was actually kind of close. Because another thing feeding into Tartaglia's perpetual misinformation spreading is that Sandrone and Capitano were apparently having tea parties together, so I mean, granted though, that could have started after we met him in Liyue, which would make sense. But at the same time, though, I'm taking everything Tartaglia says about the Fatui Harbingers from here on out with many a grains of salt. And now the question that will be being asked slightly towards the end of each video within the series: do I think this particular Harbinger was introduced at the right time? And for Capitano, it's a 50-50 for me. Now, I do think he does have his place in Natlan. The role he played in the Archon quest was honestly perfect, especially with how they wrapped his character. Would I have loved for him to be playable and for him to still be around? Yes. However, I do really like what they did with him. And I won't lie, Natlan kind of feels like the only place he would have fit before Conria. I don't think they could have introduced him any earlier, because I don't think it would have worked. Unless they had introduced him in one of the Dainsleif interludes, but that wouldn't have really made sense outside of his connections to Conria, so I do think Natlan wound up being the best decision. Outside of maybe Snezhnaya. But that also feels kind of obvious, so yeah, I do think Natlan wound up working out, especially with, again, the story they wound up going with for him. For anyone who doesn't know, during the Conrian Cataclysm, he served as a commander. However, as things got worse and worse and worse, he was left deeply scarred, and the remnants of his platoon fled to Natlan. In a way, I think many would consider this a cowardice move, which is likely why, after arriving in Natlan, he continued to fight against the Abyss as if to prove he wasn't a coward, before inevitably, when we meet him in-game, being the one to sacrifice himself for the people of Natlan, the people he had fought to protect 500 years prior. So yes, as upset as I am that he will likely never be playable because he is inherently dead, like, his body is still fine, but like, he doesn't really have a soul, so I can't say I hate the way they took his story. But anyway, that essentially wraps the first episode of this new series. Got 2 new series running at once. What's with me? I don't know. Part 2 will come out sometime in February, in which we will be doing Dottore, aka the Doctor. But in the meantime, feel free to tell me who your favorite Harbinger is, both current and previous, along with your thoughts on the captain in the comments.